We're on the second page. You know what that means? It means we've made exponential progress over here. We're on the second page.
3 lessons for every page.
I don't know. It could be more. Anything is possible.
Sure, for every page.
So this is going to be our overall introduction to what we should and what we should not expect from the Gemorah. And the reason that that's so important is, have a look. So the reason that that's so important is because I think a lot of people have misconceptions of what we should expect from the Gemorah. And if you have that misconception, as one of my favorite quotes goes from Yogi Berra, if you don't know where you're going, you'll probably land up somewhere else. So if you don't know what you're supposed to be getting out of the Gemorah, you'll probably not get what you're supposed to be getting out of the Gemorah. You got a spare set there?
Yeah.
So there you go. Okay. So we've identified 5 things to expect, 4 things not to expect from the Gemorah. I'm not going to say that this is necessarily an exhaustive list, but it's pretty important stuff. So the first thing you could expect from the Gemorah is that it's going to give insight into the Mishnah, and that is not just useful information, but that also helps us to understand the style and approach that the Gemorah is going to take. It's going to typically start by quoting a Mishnah, and as we've already learned, the Mishnah does things in a highly concise manner, which means it's quite likely that there'll be information in the Mishnah we could miss if we're not actually learning the Gemorah. So, the average person thinks, Mishnah is quite straightforward, it's quite simple, they teach it at a younger age in school because it is simpler in its presentation, but there is so much layering within the Mishnah and behind the Mishnah that if you don't have the Gemorah, then you can't expect to understand what the Mishnah is saying. So let's try and work this out. What am I looking for? If the Gemorah is helping me understand the Mishnah, what am I looking for? What do I expect it to do?
How it applies to other situations.
Okay, so you're jumping already to how it applies to other situations. But before you put in the word other,
how they arrive at the...
That's it. How did the Mishnah get there? How did the Mishnah get there? Mishnah makes a statement, right? Let's throw out a Mishnah. Come, you've learned some Mishnahs along the way. Throw out a line from a Mishnah. Any Mishnah. Pick a Mishnah, any Mishnah. Right? Emasai Kohen Shema Ba'arvis, right? Which is the first Mishnah of the entire Shas, of the entire Gemorah. From when do you start to say the Shema at night? So then how does it continue? Mishah shahakohanim nichnosim lechol bitrumasan. From the time that the Kohanim come in to eat their truma, their tithes. Okay? Let's take that line. It's a great place to start. Let's take that line. I mean, besides the fact that it's the first Mishnah of the entire Shas, so it's a great place to start. So let's go here. May Emasai Kohen Shema Be'arvin. From when do you start to read the Shema in the evenings? What's the first question you should have? And I'm not saying necessarily it's going to be the first question in the Gemorah. Who says you have to read the Shema in the evening? Where do you get that from? How do you know you have to read the Shema in the evening? Okay, so we're at a bit of a disadvantage because we are 15, 18, 2,000 years down the line of people saying Shema in the evening. So we say, well, obviously, because that's what you do. You say Shema in the evening. How do you know? That's what Gemorah is going to do. So therefore you should expect, not only is Gemorah going to give us insight into the Mishnah, but by extension, it's going to help us or push us to essentially question everything that we think that we know. How do you know you say Shema in the evening? Where did that even come from?
Long side quest. You end up double clicking.
We're not there yet. We're just right at the beginning. Before you go down any simple thing, everybody takes it for granted that you say the Shema. How do you know they say the Shema? How do you know they have to say it in the evening? And if you have to say it in the evening, then you get to the next question. When is the evening? May Amosai. From when do you have to start saying the Shema? What's the earliest time they can say the Shema? That's the joke that we always make about if any other religion had to apply the kind of rules that we apply in ours, it would be a whole different story, right? Lahavdil. Can you imagine? What's the earliest time to look for the eggs? Yeah? What's the minimum amount of eggs you have to find to be yotzei?
Have you heard that?
How big does the egg have to be?
The comedian Elon Gold talks about a tree.
Exactly, same concept.
The X was true.
Same concept, right? So May Amos. First, what is considered evening? So you have two questions over here right now. Number one, how do you know you have to read the Shema in the evening? Number two, what constitutes evening? And that's going to take us down a sidebar, because if you're talking about evening, what else in Judaism has to be in the evening? It's going to take us into another whole question. So then the Mishnah tells us, when is the earliest time to say the Shema? From the earliest time that the Kohanim can eat their, it doesn't just say eat, nichnosin, they come in from where? Come in to where? Lecho b'tumasan, to eat their truma, their tithes.
So that's the Mishnah. You're reading the Mishnah.
That's the Mishnah. So now the Gemara is going to have to ask all these, what?
And why are you using such an obscure example?
Yeah, thank you. Let me ask, exactly. What do you know more about, Shema or Truma? What do you know more about?
Always do that. They give
No. Hold on. Before you say what do you know more about, Shema or Truma? Shema. Why?
Everyday thing.
Because we don't live in the time that they lived. Why do we know more about Shema than Truma? Because we don't live in the time that they lived. But in their days, the Truma was part of their world. It was a big part of their world. It was an identifying element of how day and night works. It was a reference point for them. It's not obscure for them. It's obscure for us because we're 2,000 years late. But it wasn't obscure for them.
Is
Okay.
it also like a reason they ask they answer with obscurities, not only because it's a better reference for them, but it gives an opportunity for the reader to double click on the side path and learn other.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Mishnah wants things to be as accessible as possible. So therefore, that's Gemorah. Mishnah wants to be as accessible as possible. So the Mishnah wants to give you frames of reference that are relevant for you, that are part of your reality. Gemorah will take us through the hyperlinks. Okay? But Mishnah's not going to. Okay, so there's an example, right? Then the Mishnah's going to continue. What's the latest time that you could say the Shema? And then it's going to give you three options. Right? There's three options. Right? There's different. Chachamim say that till Chatzois. Rabbi Gamliel says till the morning. There's all these different opinions about how late you could say the Shema, and that's going to open up another whole series of questions that the Gemara is going to have to ask. Why those time frames? What? And besides the fact, obviously, that it's going to test us a little bit about who said what for which reason, which is really point number 2: insight into opinions. Why do we have these opinions? Where did they get to their different opinions from?
Can you see why is it said on the Pesach? The Seder, I said as well.
What? No. It's something else at the Pesach Seder.
No, that's all about the when
Pesach Seder, we talk about how late do you have to finish eating the Pesach offering? Okay, so there you've got the discussion, very similar discussion in the sense that you've got the same debate whether it's till midnight or right, which this Mishnah will also reference.
There's a cut and paste
Right?
reference from earlier, like you can sometimes make these analogies across the previous passage.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but it's something you'll find much more within Gemorah than you'll find within Mishnah. Okay.
There are also layers in the mission that they're assuming you've either got knowledge of. Like this whole thing about the priest coming into the truma, there's a whole thing about impurity before.
Exactly. So I was going to get to that. That's what nichnasin, coming in from where?
Yeah.
So there's one word in the Mishnah that they're coming in. They're coming in from where? But what? Are you telling me that a Kohen can only eat truma at night? What does that mean? So then you've got to dig deeper, and then you've got to discover that there's this possibility of a person being in a state of impurity, and when a Kohen is impure, he's not allowed to eat his truma, and then he has to go to the mikveh, and he needs 2 steps in order to become pure, well, depending what impurity it was, but it's assumed knowledge, right? So you got this generic need, not generic. Basically, you've got this, well, the most generic form of tumah, let's call it that, most generic form of impurity requires 2 steps in order for him to be able to eat his truma. Number 1, he has to go to the mikveh during the day, because most mikveh immersions are during the day, which we're also not familiar with, because we don't do most mikveh immersions anymore. And then the second thing he needs is what's called harav shemesh. He has to wait for the sun to set after having gone to the mikveh. Therefore, when does he come in? When is he allowed to enter the space of eating his truma? At night. Okay, so that's assumed knowledge, exactly. So there's a lot of assumed knowledge, and the Gemara is going to have to fill in those gaps for us. Okay? Really, really important perspective. Okay. What's the second thing we could expect from the Gemorah? So the first thing we expect from the Gemorah is that it's going to give us insight into the Mishnah, what the Mishnah is trying to tell us, where in turn the Mishnah is giving us insight into what the Torah had to say, etc. Okay, fine. The other thing is that it will give us insight into opinions. That refers both to the opinions that are in the Mishnah and the opinions that are in the Gemorah. In other words, we have to expect that any time somebody states something in any of the sources, whether it's a Mishnah source or Gemorah source, you have to expect that the key question that will follow is, why? Why are you saying that?
Where do you know it from?
Well, that's why, right? Why are you saying that? It doesn't have to be where do you know. It could be what's your logic.
No, but isn't it always?
No. Sometimes your argument could be based on logic. So why did you say that? And why were you not willing to agree with his opinion? And a lot of the analysis in Gemorah is exactly that. Why does this opinion not agree with the other? In other words, why are they debating?
And Kashas come into it now.
Leave all of that terminology, because we're going to get to the terminology.
Where does the oral law come into it?
What do you mean, where does it come into?
So that what was passed down, obviously the discussion of the oral law, that was written down because they were worried that they were going to lose it. Is that the Mishnah?
That is the Mishnah and the Gemorah and the Midrash
So
and
even
all
the
of that
Gemorah
collectively.
falls under.
Yes. Yes.
Then you're saying that initially it was when they got it from Sinai and when Moses brought it down, that was originally all there. Or is it, and even the explanations and all the debates and all that, but these are
Okay.
debates.
Okay. Good question. So what you're asking is, if everything was presented at Sinai, it's a double-edged question. Then were the arguments presented at Sinai?
Yes.
That's the one side of the question. The other side of the question is, if there are arguments, did we miss something that was given at Sinai? Okay.
Was the written up so we're forgetting?
No, 1 second. But let's just, this is a very important question. So this is a statement of our sages. Kol ma shetalmid vasik asid lechadesh. Anything that an astute student will innovate in Torah, nitna le Moshe misinai, was given to Moshe at Sinai.
So
That is an incredibly difficult concept to understand.
they're not arguments in truth.
Good point. But what is, and I agree with that point completely. I'm going to come back to that in a second. What does that mean? That means, if for argument's sake, I give you a book to read. When you read the book, you discover something that the author was saying that I hadn't thought of. Was that the author's insight or your insight? You're basically exposing something that the author included in the book that I didn't pick up on.
So I should put all the knowledge in the world.
So everything's in the Torah, but there are different people who are given the opportunity to expose different parts and also at different times in history.
So the author thought of it now.
It's all in there. There's different people who are given the opportunity to expose different information at different points in history. That's the first thing you have to know. The second thing is, to Steve's point, the debates are not really debates. And that's one of the greatest misconceptions. If you have a look in the second part of this page, what not to expect from Gemorah, do you see the first thing on the list there is discord. Don't expect discord.
Sometimes I don't say nice things to each other.
Debate, yes.
Arrows. What's the mashal?
There's a whole lot.
So it also
Kiddush
those
is
debates
right.
will
It's a whole lot.
crystallize the what was the original.
Well, the debates will achieve two things. The one is they will crystallize for us what should happen in practice, and they will crystallize a version that is valid even if it can't be practiced. So if that sounds abstract, the best example of that is Hillel Shammai. That's the best example of that. Or more correctly, as we say, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, because it's a whole school of thought. The Academy of Hillel and the Academy of Shammai. There are core basic differences between the approach of Hillel and Shammai to learning Torah and to how Torah should be applied. And generally, what you'll always find is, in the vast majority of cases, the school of Hillel, which means Hillel himself as well as all of his students in his academy, they will typically take the approach that is the most inclusive. In other words, the easiest point of entry for people, the most lenient approach. Whereas Shammai, and by extension Beis Shammai, will typically have a very high ideal, a very high expectation. That's why many of the debates, Hillel is saying permitted, and Shammai is saying forbidden.
But sometimes it doesn't transpire like that. Because
That's what I said. The majority of cases.
Protective or less.
That's what I said,
protective.
majority of
Sometimes
cases.
It's not so easy to figure out which is lenient.
Fine.
Which is
Majority of cases. Okay? The question is why? And the question is, and this is going to be very insightful information, so keep this in mind for many of the debates. How do you decide if the law is like Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai? You've got two schools, two different approaches. One is much stricter than the other. How do you decide who to follow practically?
More lefty than the other ones.
Is
More
there is-
front than
is
the
Mashiach
other.
in the room?
Follow what? Why?
What resonates better with
Because you give
No, that's a terrible way to
Is
decide.
Mashiach in the room? Yes or no?
What do you mean?
Mashiach's in the room. It's Shammai, and if he's not, it's Hillel.
No, that's the no. You the point that you're making has validity, but it's completely
Yeah,
not the
it's
way.
a throwaway.
No, but you can't do that because you throw everybody off the scent. So, no. How do you decide the halacha? You've got two opinions. How do you decide who to follow?
You need to understand how Hillel holds basically.
No. How do you decide how to follow? This is like so basic.
Strict interpretation of the law is
Yeah,
better.
No.
That's according to Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai.
We're at the end of the Gemorah.
They are.
And if it doesn't
Or
say,
they'll say teku and then you screw.
so how do you know? How do you decide who to
People
follow?
held different ways back then.
Well, you don't know
Ha-
how from Gemorah.
You don't learn halacha from Gemorah, but what did they do in those days where there was only Gemorah?
They had different communities.
What, you're saying the different communities followed differently?
Followed different rabbis.
Really?
So, yeah.
So there was a community that followed the school of Shammai and the community that followed the school of Hillel? Absolutely not. One of the clearest things the Gemara tells us is that when the halacha is like one, the other had to follow. There's the famous story with Rabbi Eliezer, with Rosh Hashanah, with Rabbi Gamliel, where he has to appear in public carrying his things through the streets to show that today is... Thank you. Acharei rabim lahatos, you have to follow the majority. Which means to say you have all of the sages hearing the different views, and then they weigh in and say, do we say that the halacha should be X, or do we say the halacha should be Y? And you follow the majority, which then, and that's why I said this is such an important insight that you've got to hang on to, why would the majority, in most cases, follow Beis Hillel?
That's a good question.
Which was the
Because more lenient? Is that a reason to follow him? Because more lenient? I'm not saying no. Let's go down that road. Because it's, and therefore, is that a reason to follow him? By that argument, maybe we should accept other variations of Judaism that are not Orthodox because they're more accepting, more lenient. Why did they follow Beis Hillel? Why did they follow Beis Hillel? This is so, it's so obvious, resonated with them. Why?
Easier to understand.
Not necessarily. Sometimes they're not easier to understand.
It's more protective of
Easier
Torah
to apply.
than Gezerah.
Why is it more protective of Torah?
Because it's Gezerah.
Is being more inclusive protective of Torah?
It's not so simple.
It's so simple.
You're trying to quetch it out.
It's so simple. You know why the majority followed them? Because they had a bigger yeshiva.
It's a numbers game.
That's the reality. There were more students of the Hillel persuasion than of the Shammai persuasion. So therefore, when they needed a majority, they had a majority. It's no different to any democratic system.
No, democratic.
So there's no mysticism behind it. My whole Mashiach story.
I didn't say that. I'm just talking about what happened. Just talking about what happened.
Bigger...
Oh, thank you. And why did they have a greater following? Why did they have greater appeal in the community? Now we're getting to the crux of it, so you don't have to panic about your Mashiach because they're still there. What? Why? Why?
Better food at the Kiddush.
No. No. I mean, it's a good attitude, but no. Why?
Kesef.
Because they understood that that's what the world needed at that time.
That feeds into my thing.
Exactly your point. And therefore Shammai is 100% relevant, just not in the here and now. And therefore we're told that when Moshiach comes, the law will follow Shammai. Why? Because the majority will see that now we can handle Shammai's high ideals.
Oh,
So they're both valid. They're both valid. And that's one of the most important things you have to understand about Gemorah specifically and Judaism generally. When there are different views, proper, halachic, Torah views, they're not at loggerheads. They're looking at perspectives. And sometimes there's a perspective that is relevant and a perspective that's not relevant. Sometimes there's a perspective that you have to know in order to understand Judaism, and a different perspective you have to know in order to actually apply it. And that's valid. It's valid to have an ideal and a pragmatism. An idealism and a pragmatism. It's valid. What's that?
When a pasuk comes in,
No.
comes in and he says, like, I'm giving you.
Oh, posek. I thought you said a pasuk.
No, pasuk. Where I'm giving you where you're holding.
100%. 100%. That's such a good observation because, in order for a person to be able to rule halachically, we always say they have to know the 5th volume of the 4 volumes of the Shulchan Aruch. So what's the 5th volume? Understanding who you're dealing with. If you go to a rabbi who has the same response halachically to different people in different circumstances, that's not a good rabbi. It's the easiest thing in the world to say, party line. But Judaism is more nuanced than that. And it allows for the possibility of a range of access points. So therefore, if you have a Rabbi Akiva, and you have a Rabbi Gamliel, and you have a Rabbi Yehuda, and you have a Rabbi Meir, and you have a Hillel, and you have a Shammai, and they're giving us different perspectives. It's not to say that the one is correct and the other one is not correct. The one is applicable, the one is ideal, or the one is telling us the philosophy of the concept, the other one's telling us the application of the concept. And that's how you build Judaism. So that's what you should expect from Gemorah. You shouldn't expect resolution to practical issues only.
There were also, this is for us and this is for them. You see that?
Yes, you see that with Bavel and with the Jews living in Israel and Jews. Right, exactly. Right, that's exactly that. There was a standard for them, a standard for us. Real thing. I'll give you another example. There are quite a number of halachic issues where we say it depends on the milieu of the particular society. How the halacha differs from one society to the other would depend on the situation of that particular society. Very often, as the distinction the Gemorah will often say between the Babylonian reality and the Israeli reality, where their whole environmental realities were completely different. Their whole societal realities were completely different, and so sometimes the halachas were different.
So, do Hillel and Shammai appear in the Gemorah?
Only in the Mishnah.
Oh, they're not.
But the Gemorah will analyze Hillel and Shammai or Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Much more common. It's Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai rather than the individuals Hillel and Shammai.
So then, how does Sephardi and Ashkenazi come in?
Okay, so Sephardi and Ashkenazi is much further down the line.
Yeah.
And Sephardi and Ashkenazi will only have difference in terms of minhag, not in terms of. Okay, I've got to be careful how I say this because there are halachic differences as well. So that's why, for example, there's certain things that Ashkenazim would not accept in terms of kashrus that comes from Sephardim and vice versa. But it's not. But
Rice and popcorn.
no, that's minhag. I'm talking about halacha. I'm talking about actual halacha. So there are the issues, for example, in the preparation of meat, of kosher meat. There's like very major distinctions. These are things that emerged hundreds of years after the Gemorah because of again societal realities. Like kidneys is a great example. What kind of basic foods they had versus what kind of basic foods they had. So what they could afford to exclude on Pesach, what they couldn't afford to exclude on Pesach. But that's never going to be at any core value concept within Judaism. So they're not going to have a different view of what kosher means. They're just going to have a different view of what it takes to get there. That's where you'll find some degree of nuance. But Sephardi and Ashkenazi is much later down the line. And okay, yeah. So leave it at that for now. Okay, point number 3. You have to expect from the Gemorah robust authentication of principles, and I think that's one of the things that unfortunately is quite lacking in modern society. Like a robust analysis of whether something is valid or not. In today's world, just people throw things out and it catches a little bit of sentiment and that's already enough for... exactly. Feelings don't care about your facts. So
So what does that mean? That they're authenticating what's in the Mishnah?
No, it means they're authenticating the understanding of what the Mishnah said. So if I have an opinion and I say this is what the Mishnah meant, we're not going to say, oh, you're a great guy, so we're just going to accept your opinion. That's never going to happen. We're going to test that opinion. And we're going to test that
It
thoroughly.
always says, and I agree with.
Right? Of course, if there is consensus in the Mishnah and it never went into debate in the Gemara, there's no reason why we have to authenticate it. That's the greatest authentication. If all the Jews are agreeing about something, what greater authentication can you ask for? But the minute there is any level of debate, then everybody's going to be taken through the third degree. Because we're not willing to settle on something unless it has been really thoroughly checked.
Often there's a debate about where the actual debate is. So sometimes you start out thinking that they're arguing about something, and it goes for lines and lines and lines, and then you find out, oh no, actually everybody agrees, it's just on this tiny little.
Correct. So that's not a debate about what they're debating about. That is the authentication process. So you start, very often the Gemara will do that. It will start with a premise, what we call a havamina. It may then have a full-on conversation with all the debates back and forth, even for pages, all validating the premise, only to then say, but that's an incorrect premise. So that's what I mean by robust authentication. You don't even get to suggest a theory that won't carry through to the finish line unless that theory is heavily checked. It's a really important thing to remember. And by the way, on that note, just throwing out this term, once the Gemara introduces a premise, and in the same conversation it may introduce multiple premises, right? This premise, then we reject that, then we give another premise, we reject that, till eventually we reach a conclusion. One of the most confusing things that could happen in Gemara is if you lose sight of whether we're dealing with the premise or the conclusion. So I'll explain to you what I mean by this. So often, you'll learn a page of Gemara. At the top of that page...
Not that often.
At the top of that page, the Gemara will propose a premise. It will then go through this whole robust authentication process and arrive at a conclusion the premise is incorrect, and therefore it will land at a separate conclusion. Then you'll go back and you'll start reading the commentaries on the page of Gemara that you've just read. So you may read Rashi as you're going to help you understand it, but you might not. You might learn through the page and then go back to Rashi, or go back to the Tosfos, etc. And then you're going to see Rashi or the Tosfos say something, say, how can they say that? We know what the conclusion of the Gemara is. And the answer is very simple. They're not talking about the conclusion. They're interpreting the premise. So don't use information that you already have from further down the page to ask questions on what Rashi, Tosfos, or any of the other commentaries are saying earlier in the page. If you're living with a premise, you're living with a premise. And all the comments you're going to make are irrelevant, or I should say, what's irrelevant to your comments is anything the Gemara is going to later prove. Because every line has to be independently validated, explained, explored. And that comes to my next point about the unique form of logic. The Western mind doesn't think that way.
Let's hold that thought.
Exactly. Hold that thought. And the Western mind doesn't think that way. The Western mind is always jumping ahead. Oh, I think I have a solution. Forget about it. Forget your solution. We don't need your solution right now. We need to understand what the Gemara is grappling with. Don't try solve when the journey is actually the exploration. And that's one of the biggest traps of Gemara. People are constantly looking for a bottom line. And Gemara doesn't always give you a bottom line. It can be highly frustrating. It doesn't even have to be as dramatic as a teiku. But it can be very frustrating where you've spent pages and pages trying to understand a concept, and then the Gemara basically ends and goes on to a new topic, and you're like, but what was the conclusion? And you have to learn a whole set of skills to be able to extract a conclusion out of a Gemara. And like Yudi said, that's why we don't decide halachic realities from a Gemara, because it often doesn't do that for us. Okay, so we've got to, in a certain respect, suspend the Western line of thinking when learning Gemara.
It teaches that the value is not always in the answer.
The value is the exploration, the journey, right? 100%. Remember, one of the greatest values of not working for a conclusion, but rather working for the exploration, is that it teaches you how to explore topics that didn't exist in those days. If I just gave you solutions, then when new problems arise, you don't have the tools to be able to address those new problems. Whereas if I've taught you a way of a methodology of learning the Torah and of verifying an opinion, whether it's halachically viable or not, etc., etc., you now have a toolbox that you could use no matter what life throws at you. And that's why people are constantly...
Isn't it Singapore or someone learns Gemorah at school?
South Korea.
South Korea, they learn Gemorah at school.
I don't know if it's for that reason. They use it more for intellectual development.
But that's to my point.
No, but I'm saying they would never have the interest in knowing a toolbox of how Judaism applies in the modern world, because they're not looking to apply Judaism in the modern world. 100%, but we're saying something different. This is not about sharpening your intellectual skills. This is knowing how Judaism operates. So when you hit the 21st century, and now you have questions about lab-grown meat, and about cloning, humans, and about AI, and whatever the case is, you have a toolbox of how the Torah would apply to these situations, because you weren't just told what the law is in X case. You were told how you derive a law and how you test the validity of your derivation, etc. Besides the fact that Gemorah, just for fun, if you can say that, sticks in a whole bunch of really beyond their time scientific moments. Right? I don't know if you're familiar with this, but probably the most classic example, I don't know if I told this earlier in the series or not, but probably the most classic example. The Gemorah says that if a baby dies after its bris because of excessive bleeding, then the next brother that is born still has a bris. If that brother dies of excessive bleeding, none of the subsequent brothers are allowed to have a bris. Okay, so generally speaking, in Jewish law, we speak about a chazaka. A chazaka is something that repeats 3 times. But when it's a matter of life and death, a chazaka is after 2 occasions. 2 occasions of a threat to life is considered a chazaka. So going forward, that family never gives any more of their boys a bris. So far, so good. To us, the most logical thing in the world. Then the Gemorah continues. If that couple divorces and remarries, and the father now has a son, he is required halachically to give his son a bris. If the mother has a son, she's halachically forbidden to give her son a bris. So let's ask the doctor in the room. What are you identifying here clinically? Hemophilia. Hemophilia is carried by males and carried by females. The female's the carrier, and the male is the one who has the thing, the condition. When was heredity discovered by the scientific world? Heredity, the concept of heredity, something like that, 150 years or something like that. I don't remember exactly. Again, you can ask the doc, to check, or you can Google. Certainly not more than 200 and some years ago, right? The concept of heredity did not exist in the scientific world. Here the Gemorah is not only talking about the concept of heredity, it's identifying that there are hereditary diseases where one gender, are we allowed to say that, is the carrier without being a victim of the condition that can then pass it on to a child of the opposite gender who actually suffers the condition. It's light years ahead of its time. It's one little example. There are others as well. And that's not to illustrate that that's how we know how to apply halacha, but it does illustrate that the Gemorah has insight into things that would only emerge to the rest of society at a later point. And therefore it's so important that we understand this, that we learn this logic of how Gemorah works, because if we ever want to have a contemporary version of Judaism, we have to have this toolbox. You can't just rely on some book that's going to have all the answers. There's no such thing as a book that has all the answers. There's a book that has the right questions. And if you know the right questions to ask, you know how to test the validity of the responses to those questions, then you're good to go. How long ago?
It's not so simple.
Not so simple. Okay. That's a very Gemorah.
Conceptually, long time ago, very recent.
The term heredity is a very...
So specifics is very recent,
Yeah.
late 19th century. Conceptually back to the Greeks. They could see that their children had blue eyes. And
Fine, but not the concept of a carrier and this kind of thing did not exist. Anyway, so therefore you have to expect that when you're learning Gemorah, what you are learning is not to find results, but to learn how to think as a Jewish person, how to analyze as a Jewish person, how to extract information out of the Torah and apply it. And that's why we talk about this unique form of logic. What's unique about this form of logic is that there's hierarchy, so certain people in certain times have greater authority than people in later times, we find that difficult to swallow because we live in a reality where we say, but we have more information than what they had previously. And that might be factual, but we definitely do not have the wisdom that they had previously. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. The other thing is that the Gemorah will spend a long time analyzing a topic, as we've already seen, and then at the end say, well, actually, that was all hypothetical, and we're going to take a different approach. Why did you do that? Why did you invest so much time in a hypothesis? And the reason is because we're not here for bottom lines. We're here to learn all the perspectives of how you're supposed to understand, think, analyze, extract in Torah thinking. And then lastly, you have to look for patterns. And I think that that's one of the most important things to know about Gemorah, because people look at the Gemorah and think, oh my gosh, there's just so much going on this page, and there's so many words, and the words don't have punctuation, and there's no vowels, and how am I supposed to find my way through this? And it's very, very overwhelming. Have you ever, I'm just looking around the room, who's done this, taking your child driving when your child wants to get their lesson, right? Their license, right? So what happens when you take your child for their first time in the car? What do they do?
They suddenly stop listening.
They smash into something.
The first thing that they do when they get into the car, when they start driving the car, is they say, there's so many things to know. Because it's very, if you think about when you got into a car for the first time, it's quite overwhelming. You know, you've got to be able to steer this thing and accelerate and brake and indicate and check your mirrors and watch your speed. And in the old days, when people actually drove cars, you have to change the gears, things like that. It's very overwhelming. So how do we all now drive completely oblivious to any of that? We don't, like, it just happens. Because you create patterns, like you get used to, like, you know how it works. Your feet on the pedals and this and whatever, like it all just becomes kind of natural. And it's like that in anything in life. If you can find patterns, it makes it a lot easier to identify what's going on, not to be overwhelmed, etc. And if we can start to identify patterns in Gemorah, it makes life a lot easier. Where eventually, after much learning, you start to say, this is this kind of, I see where this is going to go. It's this kind of a Gemorah. I anticipate this kind of a pattern. So I'm not going to be thrown off when it goes there and then comes back and changes to that thing, whatever, because I've seen it before. There are some people, I don't know if it's valid or not, but there are some people who say that there's an X amount of patterns in Gemorahs, and if you know those patterns, you're all good. I think it's a little bit cheapening for Gemorah to say, like it's X amount of patterns. But I think it is fair to say that you start to get used to and anticipate certain patterns that you should expect in a Gemorah.
But the patterns in Tanaim as well, so people will learn how a certain Tana holds.
That's different. That's not a pattern, that's a shita. That's two different things.
And they'll know, it doesn't sound like there's something that doesn't sound like Yeshita.
Correct. But that's different. So just to create that distinction, a pattern is a flow of either the statements or the arguments, etc., how they're put. A shita is a particular theme that runs right through all of that person's rulings. So as an example, in Beis Hillel, we'll say that the theme that runs right through all of their rulings is they tend to see things as they are in reality. And Beis Shammai, the theme that runs through all of their rulings is they tend to look at the potential of what else could occur or how things will pan out. So that's called a shita. That's not a pattern. That's called a shita, and we expect to see that undercurrent in all of their comments in all different areas of Jewish law. Okay, so I want to make that distinction. So a pattern is like a structural flow in a Gemorah, and a shita is a line of thought of a particular sage that will typically be consistent right throughout all of their insights and their rulings. And we're always going to look for that, right? We're going to look for that theme. Once we've identified, we're going to look for that theme. By the way, you see that in commentators as well. There'll be certain shittas that Rashi has versus shittas that the Rambam has versus shittas that the Tosfos have. And that's also going to inform what you expect to align with their particular commentary. So take, for example, in this week's parasha, so you have a debate between Rashi and the Ramban about the nature of the Aron, the ark. According to Rashi, the ark is the piece that contains the luchos, and the part that goes on top, the lid with the cherubs, is a separate thing altogether. According to Ramban, it's all one entity. Why do they have this difference of opinion? Because they have a shita, they have a theme of how they understand what the Mishkan is all about. So once you're seeing the Mishkan this way, then explains why the particular elements would be formed this way. And if you see the Mishkan that way, you're going to see the elements in a different light. And then you can apply that pretty much to all the elements once you understand what their shita is.
In terms of patterns, is that outside of the 13 principles?
Yeah, so the 13 principles could appear in any of the patterns.
But the principles come first and the patterns are inside the principles.
Well, I'd say it a little differently. I'd say if you're looking at a page of Gemorah, right? So when you've learnt enough pages of Gemorah, you get the feeling almost like there's a topography to the Gemorah,
The principles are not part of the patterns, they're a separate.
Correct. So like, for example, if you look at a page and there's not a lot of Gemorah and there's a lot of commentary, you understand that you're hitting a difficult patch. And on the other hand, if you're seeing a piece of Gemorah where there's very little commentary, this is going to be quite plain sailing. So that would be like an immediately obvious pattern, right? But then within that, you're going to have the patterns of, is this quoting a whole lot of verses? Because you'll get those kinds of Gemorah. So it quotes a verse and explains, it gives a whole lot of lessons from the verse. Or is it the kind of Gemorah that's going to drill down into a specific idea and verify how we know that this is the idea? Now, you might use one of the 13 principles within that pattern, but the 13 principles won't define the pattern. There'll be a method or a tool that's used inside that particular pattern.
And like Hava Mina is a good one as well.
So again, a Hava Mina, which is basically a hypothesis, could fit into more than one type of pattern or Gemorah, because it's what we do next with that hypothesis that will determine how this pattern is going to go.
Well, yeah, Hava Mina is always a negative hypothesis. You would have thought to say.
Hava Mina, so I wouldn't say, I don't know if negative is the right word. Hava Mina is not the conclusion. So that's validity.
Well, you would have thought, but you land up, that's not correct.
Again, you're not saying it's not correct. That's my point. It's not a negative. The Hava Mina still retains validity. It's just not the applicable version of the halacha. If it was something invalidated, they would never have included it at the end when they made the Gemorah. The fact that it's included in the Gemorah means that the Hava Mina has validity, it just doesn't have practical application.
Which is not in this case that you're discussing.
Or in practical application. So either of those, right? Either it's a Hava Mina that doesn't suit this case, or it's the Hava Mina, but it's not how we do it in practice.
Or the case you're examining is not actually the case you think it is.
That's also true, yeah. Also a possibility. Okay. To be continued.